Greetings from Tokyo, I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Wrath. Today, we're feeling a little bit under the weather, but that's not going to stop us from revisiting some old models and sprucing up a couple of our Dark Angels Terminators. Welcome to the studio and thanks for joining me. Here's an interesting fact. For the first time in my adult life, I don't own a car. The Tokyo Metro and a bicycle will get you just about anywhere you need to go, so there's really no reason to have one, but still, a strange feeling. As you might have picked up, I don't feel great. I've got my first head cold of the season, but that's not going to stop us from doing what we want to do today, and that is revisit some old models. Now, some hobbyists will tell you, don't revisit older models. Save it as a benchmark of progress so you can see how far you've improved. And you know what? I get it. It makes perfect sense. Honestly, I agree with that. But we have a 3D printer and some ideas, and I just can't leave well enough alone. So we're going to work to improve two character models from the Deathwing today. The Chaplain in Terminator armor and the Master of the Deathwing, Belial. I always thought it was Belial, but I listened to an audio drama a few weeks ago and it's pronounced Belial, so mind blown. Anyway, let's get started and I'll walk you through it. This is the Deathwing army I completed in 2019 before the world went straight to hell. But today we're going to focus on these two characters, Belial and our Chaplain in Terminator armor. This is the official model available for Belial from Games Workshop, but I'm not a huge fan, and there are two issues with it. One, it's made out of fine cast, which we can all agree is the absolute worst. And two, there's something about the pose of the legs that just isn't heroic enough. Now this is the proxy that we created using the bits from the official Deathwing Knights kit, and it's turned out pretty great, but there's something missing. The iconic banner pole from the official model. So we head over to Cults 3D, and after a quick search we found this, the Death Knight back pole, which looks to be a pretty good reproduction of the official model. And at 183 yen, given the current exchange rate, it's about 95 cents, so of course we snag that. The first thing we need to do is make sure we have the appropriate scale. Knowing that the body of the miniature is approximately 40 millimeters tall, we can create this chart within Photoshop and make sure that we have the appropriate size. Opening the model in our 3D program, we can see that it gets us about 95% of the way there, but there's a real issue. There's no base, which would make connecting it to the model extremely difficult. Using the sculpting tools within the application, I created a simple shape in order to connect it to the model. No reason to worry if the angle isn't exact here, as we can always sand it to fit. I then prepared the model for 3D printing in my slicing application. An hour and a half later, we were left with this, a resin reproduction. Skipping the priming step, I applied a layer of Xandri dust using my airbrush, and then washed the entire model using Seraphim Sepia. Once that was dry, I dry brushed the surface again with Xandri dust to bring out the details. With the foundational work done, I then glued it to the model to make it easier to paint. I began by applying my metallics. Once that was dry, I applied Basilicanum contrast in order to bring out the recesses. And when that was dry, Stormhost Silver to bring out our highlights. I then painted gold on all of the prayer scroll ornamentation, and when that was dry, washed it using Riken Flesh Shade Gloss in order to bring out the recesses. With the metallics complete, I then moved on to the icon at the top of the banner, coating it in white. Once the white was dry, I detailed the recesses using Basilicanum Gray. Moving on to the front of the banner, I began by applying a cold gray to the scroll behind the sword. Important to be neat here, as any mistakes will cause you to have to retouch the model. I then added my first highlight to the edges of the scroll to give it shape, using a mix of cold gray and white. And lastly, a final highlight of pure white on the edges of all the scroll work to make it pop. With the scroll complete, I moved on to the reds, completing the wax seals on the prayer scrolls,
and then moving back to the front of the banner in order to apply red to the sword. Once the base coat was down, I shaded the sword using a combination of red and dark elf flesh, and then highlighted using Troll Slayer orange. I then glazed the orange on the front of the blade to create a gradient highlight. And with that, our banner was complete. The Chaplain's looking pretty great as it uses bits from 4 different kits, including the Primaris Chaplain and the Dark Angel's Interrogator Chaplain. But when you compare it to this, the latest offering from Games Workshop, well, our model starts to look a little like when your mother tells you you can't have Chaplain and Terminator armor because you already have Chaplain and Terminator armor at home. It never hurts to have a plan, so I jumped into Photoshop to make a quick sketch of what I was thinking of. We know that we want some of these very large, oversized purity seals. We'd like to top those off with some gold ornamentation of some sort, maybe some skulls. And then of course, no Chaplain is complete without an overabundance of purity seals. Altogether, we're definitely looking a lot better. I jumped over to Cults to see what they had, and a quick search revealed this Crux Terminatus, as well as these purity seals. We brought both models into our 3D application, and within minutes we had our very first digital kit bash. I then made sure that they were appropriately scaled, printed them, and glued them to the miniature. For my first layer, I used Vallejo Khaki because the coverage and coloring is absolutely excellent for covering dark primers. I also used the khaki over the purity seals, as painting up to purple from the black is difficult and requires many layers, but as we see here, it worked exceptionally well over the khaki. I then painted the tome using dark elf flesh and later shaded that with Agrex Earthshade, and then applied the dark elf flesh in any areas that I would need to paint gold. I learned that in order to get a warm, saturated gold, a brown or earth tone undercolor really helps. I then applied a layer of Gehenna's gold as a base, and then on top of that, Auric Armor Gold to finish. While I waited for the golds to dry, I moved on to the purity seals on the front of the model and began applying my shading using wet blending. Starting with my shadows, mixing colors on my wet palette, I worked my way up from a dark brown back to the khaki, slowly wet blending on the model. Once I was happy with how the shading had turned out, I switched to my highlights, and using a combination of khaki and sand, created the highlights on the model, wet blending those as well. Once I was sure that the gold was dry, I applied an all-over wash of Riken Flesh Shade Gloss. And when that was dry, I brushed on Auric Armor Gold, and then finished with a dry brush of Stormhost Silver on the uppermost edges to keep the gold from looking flat. Then using a 000 brush, I applied the script and details to the purity seals on the front of the model. And with that, our improved Chaplain and Terminator armor was complete.
Well, that was fun. I really love tackling projects like this, and 3D printing has opened up an entirely new world in what's possible in customizing the miniatures. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks again for joining me. If you want to support the channel, honestly, all you got to do is like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe share the video on your social channels. You can always hit the thanks button, or if you'd like, check the Patreon linked in the description below, or maybe buy a t-shirt at our t-shirt shop, bakingsodatees.com. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.